Humans break in deep space, your bones dissolve, your muscles atrophy, your brain deteriorates. The real horror of interstellar travel isn't the distance. I'm showing you exactly what happens to your biology out there and why every solution we've tried fails. If you're fascinated by the real challenges of space exploration, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let's get started. What if I told you that right now, particles that were born in the violent death throes of stars, thousands of light years away, are passing through your body? They're called cosmic rays, and in the safety of Earth's magnetic embrace, they're mostly harmless. But out there, in the vast darkness between solar systems, they become one of the deadliest threats any traveler would face. Let's talk about what cosmic rays actually are. When a massive star collapses and explodes in a supernova, an event so energetic that for a brief moment it can outshine an entire galaxy, it accelerates particles to nearly the speed of light. These particles, mostly protons and atomic nuclei, go screaming across the galaxy with energies that make anything we can produce in our most powerful particle accelerators look like a child's toy. Some of these cosmic rays carry energies of over 1 billion electron volts. To put that in perspective, that's 1 billion times more energetic than the particles constantly streaming off our sun. Here on Earth, we don't think about cosmic rays much because we have two incredible shields protecting us. First, there's our planet's magnetic field, a bubble generated by the churning iron core deep beneath our feet. This magnetosphere deflects most charged particles, sending them spiraling away into space or funneling them toward the poles where they create the shimmering auroras. Second, we have our atmosphere, a blanket of air over 100 kilometers thick that absorbs and scatters the cosmic rays that do make it through the magnetic shield. But in interstellar space, you would have neither. You would be naked before the cosmic storm. According to research published in 2026 by the European Physical Journal, galactic cosmic rays represent one of the most significant hazards for any journey beyond Earth's protective bubble. Scientists at the University of California, Davis, broke down the radiation environment in space into 3 categories. There's the solar wind, relatively low energy particles constantly streaming from our sun. These carry energies of just 1 to 10 kiloelectron volts. They sound scary, but actually, they wouldn't even penetrate the hull of a spacecraft. Then there are solar energetic particles blasted out during solar flares. These are hundreds of times more powerful and definitely dangerous, but they're sporadic, predictable to some degree, and could be shielded against with sufficient water or other materials. But then come the galactic cosmic rays. These are the real monsters. With energies reaching up to a giga-electron volt, that's 1 billion electron volts. They don't just pass through spacecraft hulls. They pass through everything. Your ship, your spacesuit, your body, your DNA. Here's what happens when a high-energy cosmic ray particle slams into your body. First, there's the direct damage. The particle tears through your cells, ripping apart DNA strands, destroying proteins, damaging the delicate machinery that keeps your cells alive. But that's just the beginning. When these particles collide with atoms in your spacecraft's hull or even in your own body, they create secondary radiation. Neutrons, gamma rays, fragments of atomic nuclei, all showering through your tissues. It's like a microscopic shotgun blast at the molecular level. Studies estimate that during a long-duration space mission, every single cell in your body would be hit by a high-energy proton every few days. Every few weeks, helium nuclei would tear through, and every few months, heavy charged particles, what scientists call HZE particles, would penetrate your cells. These heavy particles are particularly devastating because they create dense tracks of ionization as they pass through tissue. causing clustered damage that's incredibly difficult for your cells to repair. The health consequences, they're sobering. Increased cancer risk, certainly. But that's not all. Cosmic ray exposure damages your cardiovascular system, increasing the risk of heart disease. It impairs your central nervous system, potentially causing cognitive problems, memory issues, even changes in behavior and mood. Research from the Helmholtz Association in Germany, published in March 2026, emphasizes that these galactic cosmic rays are the most significant long-term health concern for any mission beyond Earth's magnetic field. Now you might be thinking, can't we just build better shielding? This is where physics becomes our enemy. For lower energy radiation, adding more shielding helps. But for cosmic rays, adding conventional shielding can actually make things worse. When a high-energy particle slams into a thick shield, it doesn't just stop, it fractures, creating a cascade of secondary particles that can be even more dangerous than the original cosmic ray. It's called nuclear fragmentation, and it's a nightmare for spacecraft designers. Scientists have been desperately searching for better solutions. In April 2026, researchers proposed using advanced materials like hexagonal boron nitride and boron carbide, or even layered structures combining graphene with polymers. These designs could potentially reduce mass by 47% compared to traditional beryllium shields while offering better protection. Other concepts involve magnetic shielding, using powerful electromagnetic fields to deflect charged particles, mimicking Earth's magnetosphere. But here's the catch. The energy requirements for a magnetic field, strong enough to protect a spacecraft, are astronomical, and the magnetic field itself could interfere with electronics, navigation systems, and possibly even the biological functions of the crew. There's also the option of pharmacological countermeasures, drugs that could help your body repair radiation damage more effectively. Nutritional strategies, even induced hibernation, to reduce the time your cells spend exposed and metabolically active. But all of these are still largely theoretical. We simply don't have proven solutions yet. And here's something that should really concern you. We're talking about the radiation environment during a journey to nearby star systems, but the intensity of cosmic rays varies. In the relative safety of our solar system, shielded partly by the Sun's own magnetic field called the heliosphere, cosmic ray exposure is already a serious concern. But in true interstellar space, far from any star's protective influence, the flux of cosmic rays would be even higher. You would be traveling through the darkest, most radiation-soaked regions of the galaxy. Let's do some math. Proxima Centauri, our nearest stellar neighbor, sits 4.24 light-years away. That's about 40 trillion kilometers. If you could build a spacecraft capable of traveling at 10% the speed of light, an absolutely staggering velocity that we currently have no idea how to achieve, the journey would still take 42 years. 42 years of continuous cosmic ray bombardment. Every single day, particles with the energy of bullets fired at the atomic scale would be tearing through your body. Speaking of the challenges of light-speed travel, I've explored exactly why even reaching that ultimate speed limit wouldn't solve our interstellar problems in my video. If we could travel at light speed, it still wouldn't be enough. The physics of relativity creates its own set of insurmountable barriers that might surprise you. The video is on the card above and pinned on the comments. Studies on the International Space Station, which orbits within Earth's magnetic field and thus receives partial protection, already show measurable health effects from space radiation. Astronauts returning from 6-month missions show changes in their cardiovascular systems, their eyes, their cognitive function. and that's with Earth's magnetosphere still offering significant shielding. Now multiply that exposure by a factor of hundreds or thousands for an interstellar journey. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect is what cosmic rays do to your brain. Research has shown that cosmic ray exposure doesn't just increase cancer risk, it fundamentally alters neural function. High-energy particles damage neurons and the connections between them. They disrupt neurotransmitter systems. Studies on animals exposed to simulated cosmic ray environments show behavioral changes, memory impairment, and even alterations in emotional regulation. Imagine setting out on a decades-long journey and gradually losing your cognitive edge, your memories, your very personality, eroded away by invisible particles born in stellar explosions thousands of years ago. There's something profoundly humbling about this. We are made of stardust, forged in the nuclear furnaces of ancient stars. But those same stellar processes that created us also create the cosmic rays that could destroy us. The universe gives, and the universe takes away. In 2026, scientists at the GSI Fair Accelerator facility in Darmstadt, Germany, created the first galactic cosmic ray simulator on European soil. Working with the European Space Agency, they're now able to replicate the radiation environment of deep space here on Earth. This simulator allows researchers to test shielding materials, study biological effects, and develop countermeasures without actually sending anyone into the cosmic meat grinder. It's vital work, but the results so far have been sobering. Every test confirms what the physics predicts. Cosmic rays are relentless, penetrating, and incredibly difficult to defend against. Now let's imagine you've somehow solved the radiation problem. Maybe you've developed revolutionary shielding or discovered drugs that let your cells repair damage faster than cosmic rays can inflict it. You're ready to embark on your interstellar journey, but now you face a different challenge, one that's equally rooted in the fundamental laws of physics. Time itself becomes your enemy. Einstein's theory of relativity tells us that time is not absolute. It flows differently depending on your speed and the strength of gravity around you. When you travel at speeds approaching light speed, time dilation occurs. From your perspective on the ship, time flows normally. But back on Earth, time races forward. This isn't science fiction speculation. It's established physics, confirmed by countless experiments. Atomic clocks on fast-moving jets tick slower than identical clocks on the ground. GPS satellites have to correct for relativistic time dilation, or their navigation data would be useless. For an interstellar journey, time dilation becomes extreme. Let's say you build a ship capable of reaching 90% of light speed. That's about 270,000 kilometers per second. At that velocity, traveling to a star 10 light-years away would take roughly 11 years from your perspective on the ship. But when you arrived and looked back at Earth, you would discover that 22 years had passed. Everyone you left behind would have aged twice as much as you. Plill the speed higher, and the effect becomes even more dramatic. At 99% of light speed, time dilation increases by a factor of 7. A journey that feels like a few years to you would span decades back home. At 99.9% of light speed, the factor jumps to 22. Your 10-year journey would consume 220 years of Earth history. Now, you might think this is actually a good thing. After all, you're aging more slowly. You could potentially visit distant stars and return while experiencing relatively little time. But here's the psychological devastation this creates. Every person you knew, every relationship you had, every aspect of the culture you left behind would be gone. You would be a temporal refugee, forever cut off from your own time. The Earth you return to would be as alien to you as any planet orbiting another star. But there's a more fundamental problem. We don't currently have any propulsion system that could even approach these relativistic speeds. The fastest human-made object ever created is the Parker Solar Probe, which reached speeds of about 163 kilometers per second during its close passes by the Sun. That sounds impressive until you realize it's only 0.05% of light speed. At that rate, reaching Proxima Centauri would take about 26,000 years, and the Parker Solar Probe achieved that speed by falling toward the Sun, using gravity to accelerate. In deep space, far from any massive body, maintaining such speeds requires constant energy. The energy requirements for relativistic travel are staggering. The kinetic energy of a spacecraft increases with the square of its velocity at low speeds, but as you approach light speed, relativity kicks in and the energy requirements become infinite. To accelerate even a small spacecraft to 90% of light speed would require more energy than humanity currently produces in a year, and that's just to accelerate. You would need just as much energy to decelerate at your destination, unless you plan to flash past your target star at relativistic speeds, which would make the entire journey pointless. Various propulsion concepts have been proposed. Nuclear pulse propulsion, where you detonate nuclear bombs behind your spacecraft and ride the shockwave. Antimatter rockets, using matter-antimatter annihilation to achieve the highest possible energy density. Light sails pushed by powerful lasers from the solar system. Each concept faces enormous technical, economic, and physical challenges. And even if we could build such systems, they don't eliminate the time problem. Let's talk about what happens psychologically during such a journey, even if we ignore time dilation for a moment. Research published in January 2026 in Frontiers in Space Technologies examined what they call the transition from episodic exploration to sustained habitation in space. The study emphasized that long-duration missions create psychological pressures that go far beyond anything we've experienced in human history. The International Space Station offers us a glimpse, but only a glimpse. Astronauts on the ISS are in constant communication with Earth. They can see our planet out the window, a beautiful blue marble reminding them of home. They receive regular resupply missions. Psychologically, they know they're only a few hours away from home if an emergency occurs. And still, astronauts report significant psychological stress. Feelings of isolation, interpersonal conflicts with crew members, sleep disturbances, mood changes. Now imagine an interstellar mission. No resupply, no possibility of return for decades or maybe ever. Earth would quickly dwindle to just another star in the cosmic sea, indistinguishable from billions of others. The psychological term for this is the Earth out of view phenomenon. When astronauts can no longer see Earth, when it becomes clear that home is unreachable, the psychological impact is profound. Some researchers believe this could trigger depression, anxiety, even existential crises that could threaten the entire mission. Communication becomes another nightmare. Radio signals travel at light speed, which sounds fast until you deal with interstellar distances. A message to Proxima Centauri would take 4.2 years to arrive, and another 4.2 years for any response. That's an 8.5-year round-trip communication delay. You couldn't have a conversation. You couldn't ask for advice in a crisis. You couldn't share a joke, a fear, a moment of wonder, and get any feedback for nearly a decade. You would be more isolated than any human has ever been in history. In April 2026, researchers published a study called COSMIC, which stands for Companion System for Mission Interaction and Communication. They deployed an emotionally intelligent AI companion during analog astronaut training missions to help mitigate psychological stress. The AI used advanced language models and a digital avatar interface to provide emotional support. The results were promising but also revealing. Even with an AI companion, participants in isolated and confined environments showed significant psychological strain, and this was during missions lasting just weeks or months, with the knowledge that they could leave at any time. Extrapolate that to decades in a tin can hurtling through an empty void, and you begin to see the psychological abyss. There's also the issue of crew dynamics. Small groups of people, confined together for years with no escape, no privacy, no variety in their environment or social interactions, become pressure cookers. Research from NASA's assessment of psychology in extreme environments, summarized in April 2026, studied teams in isolation for up to 350 days. They found substantial variability in how individuals responded to stress. Some adapted well, others struggled with mood disorders, interpersonal conflicts, and performance degradation. And again, these were missions where participants knew they could go home. On an interstellar voyage, interpersonal conflict could be catastrophic. There's no walking away, there's no taking a vacation, there's no calling for backup. If relationships break down, if factions form, if violence erupts, the mission could fail entirely. The crew would be trapped together, with nowhere to go and no one to intervene. History is filled with examples of isolated groups descending into conflict. Antarctic expeditions, Arctic explorations, submarine crews. Interstellar travel would multiply these pressures by orders of magnitude. And then there's the question of meaning and purpose. Humans are meaning-seeking creatures. We need goals, accomplishments, variety, progress towards something. What happens to the human psyche when you spend decades doing essentially nothing but waiting? Sure, there would be maintenance tasks, experiments, monitoring systems, but most of the time would be empty, waiting, watching the stars slowly shift position, wondering if the journey is worth it, wondering if anyone back on Earth even remembers you anymore. Some researchers have proposed induced hibernation as a solution. If you could keep the crew in a state of suspended animation for most of the journey, you would reduce psychological stress, lower life support requirements, and minimize radiation exposure. But human hibernation is still science fiction. We don't know if it's even possible. Bears and ground squirrels hibernate, but their physiology is fundamentally different from ours. Research is ongoing, but we're nowhere close to safely putting humans into suspended animation for years at a time. There's another psychological dimension that's rarely discussed but absolutely crucial: purpose and connection to Earth. Even if you manage to preserve your sanity during the outbound journey, what about when you arrive? You would be at a star system light years from home with no possibility of meaningful communication or return. Any discoveries you make, any data you collect, would take years to reach Earth. By the time scientists back home saw your findings, you would be even older, more disconnected, and the relevance of your discoveries might have faded as Earth-based telescopes and probes revealed the same information without the human cost. This raises an uncomfortable question that we need to confront honestly. Why send humans at all? Robotic probes don't suffer from cosmic ray damage the way biological organisms do. They don't need life support. They don't experience psychological distress. They can wait centuries without complaint. They can be powered down during transit and awakened upon arrival. The Voyager probes, launched in 1977, are still functioning nearly 50 years later in interstellar space. No human crew could match that resilience. The counter-argument, of course, is that humans can adapt, make decisions, and explore in ways that robots cannot. We can respond to unexpected discoveries, repair equipment in novel ways, and bring a flexibility that programmed systems lack. But with advances in artificial intelligence, this advantage is shrinking. Modern AI systems can now diagnose problems, generate solutions, and even conduct scientific investigations with minimal human oversight. By the time we develop the technology for interstellar travel, AI might be sophisticated enough to eliminate the need for human crews entirely. But let's say we decide humans must go anyway. Perhaps for symbolic reasons, or because we want to establish a permanent colony, not just a robotic outpost. That brings us to perhaps the most daunting challenge of all, one that makes radiation and psychology look simple by comparison. Life support, every breath you take, every sip of water, every bite of food, every time you use the bathroom, you're part of a complex ecological cycle. On Earth, this cycle is maintained by the biosphere. Plants convert carbon dioxide to oxygen. Water evaporates from oceans, falls as rain, flows through rivers, and cycles endlessly. Decomposers break down waste, returning nutrients to the soil. It's a vast, interconnected system involving trillions of organisms, and it all happens automatically, powered by sunlight. On an interstellar spacecraft, you would need to recreate this entire system in miniature, and it would need to function flawlessly for decades. Let's talk about what keeping a human alive actually requires. You need approximately 730 grams of oxygen every single day. You produce roughly 830 grams of carbon dioxide. You need about 2.3 liters of water for drinking, plus additional water for food preparation and hygiene. You need roughly 2,000 calories of food, which translates to about half a kilogram of dried food mass. And you produce waste: urine, feces, sweat, exhaled moisture. All of this has to go somewhere. On the International Space Station, life support is only partially closed. Oxygen is generated by electrolyzing water, splitting H2O molecules into hydrogen and oxygen using electricity from solar panels. The oxygen is breathed, the hydrogen is vented into space. Carbon dioxide is partially removed from the air using chemical scrubbers, and some is converted back to oxygen and water using the Sabatier reaction, a chemical process that combines CO2 with hydrogen to produce methane and water. But the system isn't fully closed. Water is recycled with impressive efficiency, about 93%, but there's still loss. Food is entirely delivered from Earth. Spare parts, equipment, clothing, everything comes up on resupply missions every few months. An assessment published in January 2025 analyzed the resupply situation on the ISS. The researchers found that despite advanced recycling systems, the station still depends heavily on regular cargo deliveries, gas tanks, water bags, food, spare parts, hygiene supplies, medical equipment. The list is extensive. For a 6-month mission with one crew member, NASA's baseline requirements include substantial resupply mass. Now multiply that by the duration of an interstellar mission. Decades, and there's no resupply coming. Ever. This means your spacecraft needs a fully closed bioregenerative life support system, or BLSS. The concept is elegant. Plants grow under artificial lighting, consuming carbon dioxide and producing oxygen. They also produce food. Human waste is broken down by bacteria and other decomposers, converted into nutrients that feed the plants. Water is recycled continuously. The entire system forms a closed loop, with nothing wasted and nothing lost. But here's where theory meets brutal reality. Closing the loop completely is extraordinarily difficult. Research published in August 2023 in Frontiers in Astronomy and Space Sciences developed a stoichiometric model of a fully closed BLSS. Stoichiometry is the branch of chemistry that deals with the quantitative relationships between reactants and products. The researchers tried to balance all the inputs and outputs, accounting for every atom of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, and other essential elements. What they found is sobering. Achieving complete closure is theoretically possible, but it requires incredible precision. Every element must be accounted for. If you lose even small amounts of water to leakage, or if nitrogen escapes from the system, or if trace minerals are locked up in inedible plant matter, the imbalance compounds over time. Slowly, the system drifts away from equilibrium. Oxygen production drops. Carbon dioxide accumulates. Nutrient deficiencies appear in the plants. The whole carefully balanced ecosystem begins to collapse. And it's not just about bulk elements like carbon and oxygen. Humans need trace minerals. Zinc, iron, selenium, iodine, dozens of micronutrients in precise amounts. Plants need their own suite of minerals to grow properly. If your closed system doesn't cycle these trace elements correctly, deficiencies develop. You can't just add more from storage, because in a truly closed system, there is no storage. Everything must cycle perfectly, indefinitely. Then there's the issue of energy. Plants need light to photosynthesize, and lots of it. On Earth, the sun provides around 1,000 watts of energy per square meter at the surface. To grow enough plants to feed one person and generate their oxygen requires several square meters of growing area under intense lighting. That lighting needs power, lots of power, and in interstellar space, far from any star, solar panels are useless. The sun dwindles to just another point of light, providing negligible energy. You would need to carry your power source with you. Nuclear reactors are the most viable option. They're compact, powerful, and can run for years or decades. But they add mass, complexity, and their own hazards. Reactors need fuel, shielding, cooling systems. They produce waste heat that must be radiated away into space. And they carry the risk of malfunction, which in an isolated spacecraft millions of kilometers from any help would be catastrophic. Yet without nuclear power, a bioregenerative life support system simply can't function on an interstellar voyage. Let's also consider the plants themselves. Not just any plant will do. You need species that are highly efficient at converting CO2 to oxygen, that produce edible calories and proteins, and that grow quickly in confined spaces. Potatoes, wheat, soybeans, lettuce, perhaps some fruit-bearing plants for psychological variety and vitamin content. But growing plants in space is more difficult than on Earth. In microgravity, water doesn't flow normally. It forms globules that float. Root systems that evolved to grow downward in response to gravity become confused. Nutrient delivery to roots requires carefully designed hydroponic or aeroponic systems. Air circulation must be managed because in zero gravity there are no convection currents. Carbon dioxide can accumulate in pockets around leaves, suffocating them even in an oxygen-rich environment. Plants also release ethylene gas as they grow, which can trigger premature ripening or stress responses if not removed from the air. And here's something most people never consider. Plants get sick. They're attacked by fungi, bacteria, viruses, pests. On Earth, we control these problems with pesticides, fungicides, crop rotation, and by relying on the broader ecosystem to maintain balance. Predatory insects eat pests. Beneficial microbes outcompete harmful ones, but in a sealed spacecraft, if a pathogen or pest gets into your growing system, it can spread unchecked. There's no bringing in outside help, no resupply of healthy seeds. If a disease wipes out your crops, the mission is over. Everyone dies. Research on bioregenerative systems, including ESA's Melissa project, Microecological Life Support System Alternative, has been ongoing for decades. Melissa aims to create a closed-loop system using algae, bacteria, and higher plants. They've made progress, demonstrating small-scale systems that can recycle waste and produce food and oxygen. But scaling this up to support multiple humans for decades remains an unsolved engineering challenge. The complexity is immense. The failure modes are numerous, and the margin for error is zero. There's another life support issue that's often overlooked: psychological life support. Humans don't just need oxygen, water, and calories. We need variety, flavor, texture, comfort. Eating the same bland meals day after day for years erodes morale. Astronauts on the ISS consistently report that food quality and variety are crucial for psychological well-being. Care packages from Earth containing favorite snacks, fresh fruit, or culturally significant foods are cherished. On an interstellar voyage, there would be no care packages, no fresh strawberries, no chocolate, no coffee, unless you dedicate precious growing space and resources to cultivating coffee plants, which seems absurdly inefficient but might be psychologically necessary. The same applies to other aspects of daily life. Clothing wears out. On the ISS, clothing is considered disposable because laundering it is too water and energy intensive. Astronauts wear garments for days or weeks, then discard them. They're loaded onto cargo ships and burned up in the atmosphere. On an interstellar ship, you can't discard anything. You would need systems to recycle fabric, repair garments, or synthesize new clothing from raw materials. It sounds trivial until you realize it's just one more system that must function perfectly for decades. Hygiene becomes another challenge. Humans shed skin cells, hair, produce oils and odors. We need to bathe, brush our teeth, maintain cleanliness to prevent infections. Water for hygiene must be carefully managed in a closed system. Soaps and cleaning agents must be biodegradable and compatible with your recycling systems. If you introduce chemicals that disrupt your bacterial waste processes or harm your plants, the entire life support ecosystem could fail. Medical care presents yet another dimension of complexity. What happens when someone gets sick or injured? On Earth, even in remote locations, medical evacuation is possible within hours or days. In space, you're on your own. The ISS has a small medical kit and crew members receive basic medical training, but serious medical emergencies require return to Earth. On an interstellar voyage, there is no return. If someone develops appendicitis, suffers a fracture, has a heart attack, or develops cancer, the crew has to deal with it using only the resources on board. This means carrying extensive medical supplies, diagnostic equipment, surgical tools, and a wide range of medications. But medications have shelf lives. Stored pharmaceuticals degrade over time, especially when exposed to radiation. Research cited in the January 2026 European Physical Journal paper noted that cosmic radiation can degrade both food and pharmaceuticals, reducing their effectiveness or even making them toxic. You would need the ability to synthesize fresh medications during the voyage, which requires carrying raw chemical precursors and sophisticated equipment. It also requires expertise. At least one crew member would need to be a physician, probably with surgical skills. Another would need to be a pharmacist or chemist. But here's the terrible math. The more capabilities you add to your spacecraft to address these challenges, the more massive it becomes. More mass requires more fuel to accelerate and decelerate. More fuel requires stronger engines. Stronger engines require more power. More power requires bigger reactors. Bigger reactors add more mass. It's a vicious cycle that rocket scientists call the tyranny of the rocket equation. The rocket equation, formulated by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in 1897, describes the relationship between a rocket's mass, fuel, and velocity. To accelerate a spacecraft to higher speeds, you need more fuel. But that fuel has mass, which means you need even more fuel to accelerate the fuel. The math becomes exponential. For interstellar velocities, even using the most energetic propulsion systems we can imagine, the fuel mass required becomes absurdly large. Some calculations suggest that achieving even 10% of light speed would require a fuel mass millions of times greater than the payload mass, assuming conventional rocket propulsion. It's physically impossible. Advanced concepts like antimatter propulsion or fusion rockets could theoretically improve this ratio, but they introduce their own enormous challenges. Antimatter is the most energy-dense fuel possible. When matter and antimatter meet, they annihilate completely, converting 100% of their mass into energy according to Einstein's famous equation E=mc². But we currently produce antimatter in particle accelerators in quantities measured in nanograms at costs of trillions of dollars per gram. And storing antimatter is incredibly difficult because if it touches any normal matter, it annihilates explosively. Fusion propulsion, using the same nuclear reactions that power the sun, is more plausible. We've achieved fusion in laboratories and in hydrogen bombs, but controlled, sustained fusion for propulsion remains elusive despite decades of research. Even if we solve fusion propulsion, the exhaust velocities, while impressive, might not be sufficient for reasonable interstellar transit times without enormous fuel masses. Then there's the infrastructure question. Where would you build an interstellar spacecraft? It would be so massive, so complex, that constructing it on Earth and launching it would be impossible. You would need to build it in orbit, probably in pieces, assembling it over years or decades. This requires a robust space-based industrial capacity that humanity simply doesn't have yet. We would need orbital shipyards, resource extraction from asteroids or the moon, automated manufacturing in space, a permanent workforce living off-world. We're talking about infrastructure projects that would dwarf anything humanity has ever attempted. Let's zoom out for a moment and consider the sheer hostility of the environment you would be traveling through. Interstellar space isn't empty. It's filled with what astronomers call the interstellar medium, a sparse soup of gas and dust. On average, there's about 1 atom per cubic centimeter in interstellar space. That sounds like nothing, like a perfect vacuum. And compared to Earth's atmosphere, which contains around 25 billion trillion molecules per cubic centimeter, it practically is. But when you're traveling at relativistic speeds, even 1 atom per cubic centimeter becomes a serious problem. Imagine driving a car at highway speed and having a grain of sand hit your windshield. Minor impact, tiny chip maybe. Now imagine that grain of sand is hitting you at 10% of light speed. At that velocity, kinetic energy increases so dramatically that even microscopic particles become destructive. A single hydrogen atom hitting your spacecraft at 0.1 c, that's 10% of light speed, or about 30,000 kilometers per second, carries enormous energy. Billions upon billions of these impacts every second would erode your hull, heat your spacecraft, and create secondary radiation as atoms shatter on impact. Some calculations suggest that a spacecraft traveling at relativistic speeds through the interstellar medium would need shielding several meters thick just to survive the continuous sandblasting of hydrogen atoms. And this shielding must be at the front of the ship, adding mass exactly where it's most problematic for propulsion and maneuverability. Alternatively, you might use magnetic or electric fields to deflect charged particles before they hit. But again, the energy requirements are staggering, and neutral particles like dust grains wouldn't be deflected at all. There's also the issue of larger debris. Space isn't uniformly sparse. There are denser regions, clouds of gas and dust where stars are born. There are rogue planets, asteroids, comets, objects that have been ejected from their home systems and wander the galaxy. At relativistic speeds, hitting even a pebble-sized object would be catastrophic. The impact energy would vaporize both the object and a portion of your spacecraft, possibly breaching the hull or damaging critical systems. And at those speeds, you would have almost no time to detect and avoid such hazards. An object directly in your path would be visible for only moments before collision. Detection becomes another engineering nightmare. At high velocities, you would need incredibly sophisticated sensor systems constantly scanning ahead for hazards, but light itself creates a problem. Due to relativistic effects, light from objects in front of you would be blue-shifted, increasing in frequency. Meanwhile, light from behind would be red-shifted. The entire visible spectrum would be distorted. Stars ahead would appear brighter and bluer, compressed by aberration into a smaller region of the sky. Stars behind would dim and redden, spreading out. The familiar constellations would be unrecognizable. Navigation, which relies on star positions, would require constant relativistic corrections. Then there's the question of stopping. Suppose you've somehow survived the journey and you're approaching your destination star system at 10% of light speed. You're traveling at 30,000 kilometers per second. At that velocity, you would cross the distance from Earth to the Moon in less than 13 seconds. You would traverse the diameter of our entire solar system, from the Sun to beyond Pluto's orbit, in about 17 hours. How do you slow down? You can't use air braking. There's no atmosphere in space. You can't throw out an anchor. You need reverse thrust, which means you need fuel. And remember, you need just as much fuel to decelerate as you needed to accelerate. This means that at the start of your journey, your spacecraft must carry not only the fuel to speed up, but also the fuel to slow down at the destination, plus the fuel to accelerate that deceleration fuel, plus the fuel to accelerate the fuel that accelerates the deceleration fuel. The rocket equation compounds mercilessly. Some concepts propose using the destination star system itself for deceleration. A magnetic sail could interact with the stellar wind from the target star, gradually slowing the spacecraft over a distance of billions of kilometers. Or a light sail could be deployed, catching the starlight and using radiation pressure to brake. But these methods require enormous, fragile structures and would take years or decades to slow the spacecraft enough to enter orbit. During that time, you would be vulnerable, with limited maneuverability and no ability to abort if something goes wrong. Let's talk about navigation more deeply. On Earth, we use GPS, a constellation of satellites that tell us our position to within meters. In interstellar space, GPS doesn't exist. You would need to navigate using pulsars, those rapidly spinning neutron stars that emit beams of radiation like cosmic lighthouses. Pulsars are extraordinarily regular, making them excellent navigational beacons. Several spacecraft, including Voyager and New Horizons, carry pulsar maps showing Earth's position relative to known pulsars. But using pulsars for navigation during flight requires extremely precise timing and measurement. Any error compounds over light years of distance. You could arrive at your destination star system off course by millions or even billions of kilometers, making it difficult to enter orbit or locate planets of interest. There's also the reality that stars move. They orbit the galactic center, which means their positions change over time. During a decades-long journey, the target star system would have moved considerably from where it was when you launched. You would need to constantly update your trajectory, compensating for the motion of both your origin and destination. This requires accurate models of stellar motion, which we have for nearby stars, but which become less certain for more distant targets. Now let's consider communication in more detail. We've already discussed the time delay, but there's more to it. Radio signals weaken with distance according to the inverse square law. Double the distance and the signal becomes 1/4 as strong. At interstellar distances, signals from Earth would be unimaginably weak by the time they reached you. You would need enormous antennas and incredibly sensitive receivers to detect them at all. And you would need to aim your transmitter precisely at Earth to send messages back, because any broadcast signal spreads out and dilutes as it travels. A signal that's strong enough to be detected across light years requires tremendous power and tight focusing. The power requirements for interstellar communication are sobering. NASA's Deep Space Network, the array of giant radio antennas that communicate with distant probes like Voyager, can barely detect the signals from those spacecraft, and they're still within our solar system. Voyager 1, the most distant human-made object, is currently about 24 billion kilometers from Earth, which is less than 0.003 light-years. It takes over 22 hours for a radio signal to make the round trip, and Voyager's signal, transmitted with a 23-watt transmitter, the power of a small light bulb, arrives at Earth attenuated to less than 1/1000th of a watt. Detecting it requires the most sensitive receivers ever built. Now multiply that distance by 1,000 or more for an interstellar mission. The signal attenuation becomes so severe that communicating would require either impossibly large antennas or impossibly powerful transmitters, or both. And powering such a transmitter continuously, given the energy constraints of a spacecraft, might simply not be feasible. There's a real possibility that an interstellar mission would lose contact with Earth shortly after departure, not because of equipment failure, but because the physics of signal propagation makes communication impossible beyond a certain distance. This isolation would be total. No news from home, no updates on scientific discoveries, no emotional support from mission control, no ability to report your findings until you return, if you return. You would be utterly alone in a way that no human has ever experienced. Let's shift to another fundamental barrier, one rooted in biology itself. Human bodies evolved under very specific conditions. 1 Earth gravity, or 9.8 meters per second squared. A 24-hour day-night cycle, a specific mix of atmospheric gases at a specific pressure, a magnetic field that protects us from radiation. Remove any of these conditions, and our bodies start to malfunction. We already know from decades of spaceflight that microgravity is harmful to human health. In zero gravity, bones lose density at a rate of about 1 to 2% per month. Muscles atrophy because they're not working against gravity. The cardiovascular system, which evolved to pump blood upward against Earth's gravity, becomes confused. Fluid shifts toward the head, causing facial puffiness and increased intracranial pressure. This pressure can damage the optic nerves, causing vision problems that persist even after returning to Earth. Some astronauts have experienced permanent vision changes after long-duration missions. The immune system also weakens in space. Studies show that T-cell function declines, making astronauts more susceptible to infections. Dormant viruses like herpes can reactivate, wound healing slows. The gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria that help us digest food and regulate our immune system, undergoes changes in space that we don't fully understand yet. For a journey lasting decades, these effects would compound. Bone loss might eventually reach the point where bones become fragile and prone to fractures. Even in the low-stress environment of microgravity, muscle atrophy could become so severe that even with exercise, astronauts couldn't maintain functional strength. Cardiovascular deconditioning might progress to the point where crew members couldn't survive the stress of returning to gravity. Whether artificial or planetary, one solution is artificial gravity, generated by rotating the spacecraft. If you spin a cylindrical or wheel-shaped habitat, centrifugal force pushes inhabitants toward the outer rim, simulating gravity. The math is straightforward. To generate one Earth gravity, a habitat with a radius of 100 meters would need to complete one rotation every 20 seconds. That's about 3 rotations per minute. But building a rotating habitat large enough to avoid disorienting Coriolis effects and strong enough to withstand the structural stresses adds enormous mass and complexity. Smaller radius habitats rotating faster create stronger Coriolis effects. These are the apparent forces you feel when moving in a rotating reference frame. If you walk toward or away from the rotation axis, or if you turn your head quickly, you experience strange forces and accelerations that your inner ear isn't expecting. This can cause nausea, disorientation, and motion sickness. Studies suggest that to minimize these effects, the habitat radius should be at least 50 meters, preferably larger. But a rotating structure 50 meters in radius, strong enough to support habitation modules, life support systems, and shielding would be a massive engineering project, and you can't just spin up the entire spacecraft. Your propulsion system, fuel tanks, and other components work best in a non-rotating reference frame. This means you need a complex bearing or docking system that allows part of the ship to rotate while other parts remain stationary. Such systems introduce mechanical complexity, points of failure, and maintenance requirements. There's another biological issue that rarely gets discussed but is absolutely critical for any multi-generational voyage: reproduction. If your journey spans multiple human lifetimes, crew members would need to have children in space. Those children would grow up entirely in the spacecraft environment, never experiencing Earth, never feeling real gravity, never breathing unfiltered air or seeing an open sky, and we have absolutely no idea what growing up in space does to human development. Gravity plays a crucial role in embryonic and fetal development. Bones develop in response to mechanical stress. The inner ear's balance system calibrates itself based on the direction of gravity. Muscle development depends on working against gravitational resistance. Studies on pregnant animals in space have shown developmental abnormalities, though the research is limited and the results are not always consistent, but the implications are disturbing. A child conceived and born in zero gravity might develop weaker bones, different muscle structures, altered cardiovascular systems. Their inner ear might never properly learn what down means, leaving them perpetually disoriented if they ever experience gravity. And there's a deeper question: would reproduction even work normally in space? Fertilization, implantation, placental development, all of these processes evolved under Earth's gravity. Changes in fluid distribution, hormone levels, and mechanical forces in microgravity could affect fertility, pregnancy, and birth outcomes in ways we can't predict. Some researchers worry that long-duration spaceflight might reduce fertility through radiation exposure, damaging reproductive cells, hormonal disruptions, or other mechanisms we haven't discovered yet. Even if children can be born and raised successfully in space, what about their psychology? Growing up in a confined metal container with the same handful of people, no natural environment, no diversity of experience, could create profound psychological problems. Human children need exploration, novelty, social interaction with diverse individuals. They need to take risks, experience nature, develop independence. How do you provide that in a spacecraft? You can't. Those children would be products of an environment so alien to human evolutionary history that we can't predict what they would become. There's also the ethical dimension. Is it morally acceptable to create new humans who will never have the option of experiencing Earth, who are born into a mission they never chose, who exist solely to continue a voyage started by their ancestors. These children would be, in a sense, prisoners. They couldn't leave, they couldn't opt out. Their entire existence would be subordinated to the mission's goals. Many ethicists argue that creating humans under such circumstances violates fundamental principles of autonomy and consent. Let's return to the physics for a moment and discuss another problem that sounds like science fiction but is absolutely real: quantum vacuum fluctuations. Empty space, it turns out, isn't truly empty. According to quantum field theory, the vacuum is seething with virtual particles that pop into existence and annihilate almost instantly. These fluctuations are real and have been measured. They cause the Casimir effect, where two metal plates in a vacuum are pushed together by quantum pressure. They contribute to the Lamb shift in atomic spectra. They're a fundamental feature of reality. Now, there's a theoretical effect called the Unruh effect, predicted by physicist William Unruh in 1976. It suggests that an observer accelerating through a vacuum would perceive it as being filled with thermal radiation. The faster the acceleration, the higher the temperature. For the accelerations we normally experience, the temperature is negligibly small. But for a spacecraft undergoing constant high acceleration to reach relativistic speeds quickly, the crew would theoretically experience a warm bath of radiation emerging from the quantum vacuum itself. The physics is complex, and the effect has never been directly observed. But if it's real, it represents yet another source of radiation exposure during high acceleration flight. Another exotic physics problem involves what happens when you travel at high fractions of light speed through the cosmic microwave background. This is the afterglow of the Big Bang, a faint microwave radiation that fills all of space with a temperature of about 2.7 Kelvin, just above absolute zero. From Earth's perspective, it's harmless. But due to relativistic Doppler shift, if you're traveling at 90% of light speed, the CMB radiation in front of you would be blue shifted into much higher energies. Some calculations suggest it could be shifted into ultraviolet or even X-ray wavelengths, creating an intense radiation field that adds to your cosmic ray exposure. The faster you go, the worse it gets. At velocities approaching light speed, the blue-shifted CMB could become so energetic that it would fry your electronics and crew, creating a kind of radiation barrier that limits how fast you can safely travel. Let's talk about something more immediate and practical. Food production in detail. You need approximately 2,000 calories per person per day. Let's say you're growing potatoes, which are calorically dense and nutritionally reasonable. 1 kilogram of potatoes provides about 770 calories, so each person needs roughly 2.6 kilograms of potatoes per day, or about 950 kilograms per year. For a crew of 10 people on a 40-year journey to Proxima Centauri at 10% light speed, you would need to produce 380,000 kilograms of potatoes. That's 380 metric tons. But you can't just grow potatoes. Humans need dietary diversity for complete nutrition. Proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals. You would need to cultivate multiple crop species. Legumes for protein, oil-producing plants like soybeans or canola, leafy greens for vitamins and minerals, grains for carbohydrates and B vitamin. Each crop has different growing requirements, different light needs, different nutrient profiles. Managing this agricultural diversity in a closed system, ensuring continuous production year-round with no crop failures, is extraordinarily challenging, and crops have growing cycles. Potatoes take about 90 to 120 days from planting to harvest. During that time, the plants are consuming resources, oxygen, water, nutrients, but not yet producing food. You need to stagger plantings so that harvests occur continuously, which means maintaining multiple growth stages simultaneously. This requires extensive growing area, careful scheduling, and precise management. A single scheduling error or crop failure could create a gap in food production that leads to rationing or starvation. You also need seed stock. Every generation of plants must produce seeds for the next generation. But seeds have limited viability. Stored seeds degrade over time, especially under radiation. You can't rely on stored seeds for a 40-year journey. You need to continuously produce fresh seeds, which means dedicating some of your growing capacity to seed production rather than food production. And you need genetic diversity in your seed stock. If all your potato plants are genetically identical clones, a single disease could wipe out the entire crop. You need multiple varieties, multiple genetic lines to provide resilience. This multiplies the complexity. There's another aspect of food production that's often overlooked: processing and preparation. You can't eat raw potatoes for 40 years. You need variety, flavor, texture. This means you need cooking equipment, spices, salt, preservation methods. You need the ability to dry, ferment, bake, boil. Each of these processes requires equipment, energy, and water. Fermentation, which could provide nutritional diversity and preserve food, requires specific bacteria or yeast cultures. These microorganisms must be maintained, kept healthy, prevented from becoming contaminated with harmful strains. And what about protein beyond plant sources? Humans can survive on a vegetarian diet, but many people struggle psychologically with the absence of meat. There have been proposals to raise fish or insects in space. Both are protein-dense and relatively efficient to produce. But fish require aquatic habitats, filtration systems, oxygen-rich water. Insects require their own food sources and carefully controlled environments. Either option adds another layer of complexity to an already impossibly complex system. Now let's discuss waste processing more deeply. An average human produces about 50 kilograms of feces and 550 liters of urine per year. For 10 people over 40 years, that's 20,000 kilograms of feces and 220,000 liters of urine. You cannot simply eject this into space. It contains water, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients essential for plant growth. In a closed system, you must recycle every atom. Urine processing is relatively straightforward. It's mostly water with dissolved urea, salts, and trace compounds. Filtration, distillation, and chemical treatment can reclaim the water. The urea can be broken down into ammonia, which can be converted to nitrates for fertilizer. NASA has developed urine processing systems that recover over 90% of the water. Though these systems require maintenance, replacement parts, and occasional troubleshooting, feces processing is more complex. Human waste contains water, undigested food, bacteria, dead cells, and potentially pathogens. Simply composting it like we do on Earth isn't practical in microgravity. Instead, systems like the Melissa project use bacterial bioreactors. Different species of bacteria break down the waste in stages, converting complex organic molecules into simpler compounds that can be used as fertilizer or further processed. But these bioreactors are living ecosystems themselves. They require specific temperatures, pH levels, oxygen, or anaerobic conditions depending on the bacterial species, and careful monitoring. If the bacterial populations crash or become contaminated with the wrong species, waste processing fails, waste accumulates, the system collapses. There's also the issue of trace contaminants. Medications people take are excreted in urine and feces. Hormones, antibiotics, painkillers. These compounds can persist through processing and end up in the water or nutrient streams. Over time, they could accumulate to problematic levels, affecting plant growth or human health. You would need sophisticated chemical analysis and removal systems to prevent this bioaccumulation. Air quality presents another subtle but critical challenge. In a closed environment, volatile organic compounds, VOCs, build up over time. These are chemicals released by human metabolism, off-gassing from materials and equipment produced by plants and microorganisms. Some VOCs are harmless, others are toxic at high concentrations: carbon monoxide, formaldehyde, benzene, toluene, ammonia. On the ISS, air quality monitoring has detected elevated levels of various VOCs, and scrubbing systems are used to remove them. But these scrubbers use consumable filters or chemical reactions that produce waste. In a decades-long closed system, you would need regenerable air scrubbing systems that can remove trace contaminants indefinitely without requiring replacement parts from Earth. Let's examine the psychological dimensions even more deeply, because this might be the most insurmountable barrier of all. We've discussed isolation, confinement, and monotony, but there's something even more profound at stake: purpose and existential meaning. Human beings are creatures who need to feel that our lives matter, that we're part of something larger, that our struggles have meaning. On Earth, even in difficult circumstances, we can find purpose through relationships, through contributing to our communities, through creative expression, through connection to nature and the broader world. On an interstellar spacecraft, all of these sources of meaning become attenuated or disappear entirely. Your relationship pool is limited to maybe a dozen people, the same faces every single day for decades. There's no broader community to contribute to. Any message you send to Earth takes years to arrive and years more to get a response. By the time anyone on Earth hears about your discoveries or experiences, they might not even care anymore. The mission that launched with great fanfare and public attention could be forgotten within a few years as Earth moves on to other concerns. Creative expression becomes limited by resources. You can't paint landscapes because there are no landscapes. You can't sculpt because carrying unnecessary materials like clay is wasteful. You can't play certain musical instruments because they're too large or fragile. Your creative outlets would be limited to whatever can be done digitally or with minimal physical resources. And even digital creativity loses meaning when there's no audience, no one to appreciate or respond to your work in real time, cockinge to nature. Something psychologists increasingly recognize as essential for mental health is completely severed. There are no forests, no oceans, no mountains, no weather, no animals except perhaps some insects or fish being raised for food. The only nature you experience is through recordings and memories which fade and lose their emotional power over time. You would be living in the most artificial environment ever created, surrounded entirely by technology and metal and plastic, breathing recycled air, drinking recycled water, eating engineered food. The psychological impact of this absolute disconnection from the natural world is impossible to fully predict, but research on confinement and sensory deprivation suggests it would be severe. There's a concept in psychology called learned helplessness. When an organism repeatedly experiences uncontrollable negative situations, it eventually stops trying to change its circumstances, even when change becomes possible. The organism becomes passive, depressed, unmotivated. In an interstellar spacecraft, so much is beyond your control. You can't change your environment, you can't leave, you can't meet new people, you can't explore new places. You're locked into a predetermined trajectory, both literally and figuratively. The risk of learned helplessness, of the entire crew sinking into apathy and depression, is enormous. Conversely, there's the risk of conflict escalation. In confined spaces with no escape, Interpersonal tensions that would be minor annoyances on Earth can explode into serious conflicts. Someone's eating habits, their hygiene, their conversational style, things you could normally avoid by walking away, become inescapable irritants. Research on isolated groups, from Antarctic research stations to submarine crews, shows that conflict is inevitable. Usually it's managed through leadership, social norms, and the knowledge that the situation is temporary. But in a multi-decade interstellar voyage, temporary becomes permanent. The normal pressure relief valves, talking to someone outside the group, taking a break in a different environment, knowing an end date, don't exist. There have been documented cases in isolated environments where conflicts turned violent. Antarctic expeditions where crew members had to be separated to prevent physical altercations. Submarine incidents where interpersonal tensions led to breakdowns in discipline. In every case, intervention was possible. Someone could be evacuated or the mission could be shortened. On an interstellar spacecraft, there's no intervention coming. If violence erupts, the crew has to resolve it themselves or live with the consequences. And if someone becomes so dangerous that they threaten the mission, what do? Restraining them for years? Sedating them? These aren't just ethical nightmares, but practical impossibilities in a resource-constrained environment. Now let's confront an uncomfortable reality about the scientific value of crewed interstellar missions. What would we actually learn that would justify the enormous cost and risk? Our telescopes are already incredibly powerful. The James Webb Space Telescope can analyze the atmospheres of exoplanets light years away, detecting chemical signatures that might indicate life. Ground-based telescopes like the extremely large telescope, currently under construction in Chile, with a primary mirror 39 meters across, will be able to directly image exoplanets and study their surfaces. Radio telescopes can detect faint signals from across the galaxy. We can learn an enormous amount about distant star systems without ever leaving our solar system. What would a crewed mission add? Direct surface exploration of an exoplanet, certainly. But the cost-benefit ratio is absurd. Sending humans to Proxima Centauri b would cost trillions of dollars, require decades of development, risk lives, and produce data that might only marginally exceed what advanced robotic probes could achieve. And robotic probes could be sent in greater numbers to more destinations with less risk and at a fraction of the cost. They could be designed to last centuries if needed. They could transmit data continuously without worrying about life support. Some argue that human flexibility and intuition are irreplaceable, that astronauts could make discoveries robots would miss. This was certainly true in the past. The Apollo astronauts made geological observations on the Moon that no robot of that era could have matched. But artificial intelligence has advanced enormously. Modern AI systems can analyze images, identify anomalies, conduct experiments, and even generate hypotheses. By the time we have the technology for crewed interstellar travel, AI will likely be sophisticated enough to conduct scientific research autonomously. The human element, while psychologically satisfying, might not be scientifically necessary. There's also the contamination issue. If we're searching for life on exoplanets, sending humans is potentially disastrous. Humans are walking ecosystems. We carry trillions of bacteria, viruses, fungi, archaea. Despite our best sterilization efforts, we would inevitably contaminate any environment we visit. If microbial life exists on an exoplanet, our microbes could outcompete it, destroy it, or hybridize with it, ruining the scientific opportunity and potentially committing an act of cosmic-scale harm. Robotic probes can be sterilized far more effectively. They can explore without risking contamination. So why send humans at all? The honest answer might be because we want to, because exploring is part of human nature, because establishing a presence among the stars resonates with something deep in our psychology. These are valid reasons, but they're emotional and philosophical rather than practical or scientific, and we need to be honest about that. An interstellar colony isn't about advancing knowledge or ensuring survival. It's about fulfilling a dream, about saying humanity was here. And we need to decide if that dream is worth the astronomical cost and the very real possibility of tragedy. Let's talk about another often overlooked issue: system redundancy and repair. On Earth, when something breaks, you order a replacement part or call a technician. On the ISS, broken equipment can sometimes be repaired with tools and parts on board, but often a replacement is sent up on the next cargo mission. On an interstellar spacecraft, there are no replacement parts coming. There is no calling a technician. Everything must be repairable using only the materials and tools on board. This requirement drives the design philosophy toward incredible complexity. You need redundancy. Critical systems must have backups, and those backups need backups. Life support systems, propulsion, power generation, navigation, communication, everything mission critical must be multiply redundant. But every redundant system adds mass, and we've already discussed how mass is the enemy of interstellar travel. There's a constant tension between reliability and practicality. You also need manufacturing capability. Three-dimensional printers can create replacement parts from raw materials. But printers have limitations. They can't produce everything. Complex electronics, precision bearings, optical components, these often require specialized manufacturing processes that can't be replicated with onboard equipment. So you need to carry spares of components that can't be printed. But which component? How many of each? Predicting what will break over a 40-year mission is nearly impossible. Carry too many spares and you waste precious mass. Carry too few and a single unexpected failure could doom the mission. There's also material degradation. Everything wears out. Seals become brittle and leak. Lubricants break down. Solder joints crack from thermal cycling. Radiation damages electronics. Over decades, the entire spacecraft slowly falls apart. You're constantly repairing and replacing components in a battle against entropy. And as systems age, failure rates increase. The longer the mission continues, the more likely a catastrophic cascade failure becomes, where one system failure triggers others until the entire spacecraft becomes uninhabitable. This brings us to perhaps the most profound question. Is interstellar travel even theoretically possible for biological organisms, or is the universe fundamentally inhospitable to life beyond individual stellar systems? Maybe the physics isn't just difficult but actually prohibitive. The distances are so vast, the energy requirements so extreme, the hazards so numerous, that biological life is simply not meant to cross interstellar space. Maybe the speed of light isn't just a speed limit but a quarantine boundary, ensuring that life, if it arises, remains confined to its home system. This is sometimes called the Great Filter Hypothesis in the context of the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox asks, if the universe is so vast and old, why haven't we detected any signs of alien civilizations? One possible answer is that there's some insurmountable barrier, a filter, that prevents civilizations from spreading beyond their home systems. Maybe that filter is interstellar travel itself. Maybe every civilization that tries discovers what we're discovering, that the obstacles are too great, the costs too high, the risks too severe. Maybe the galaxy is full of intelligent species, all isolated on their home worlds, all looking out at the stars and wondering the same thing. Let's examine some of the proposed solutions to these problems and why most of them don't actually solve anything. They just shift the impossibility around. One popular concept is the Generation Ship, a massive spacecraft designed to support multiple generations of humans during a centuries-long voyage. The idea is that the first crew would launch knowing they'd never arrive. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would live and die aboard the ship. Eventually, their distant descendants would reach the destination. The Generation Ship concept sounds romantic in science fiction, but the practical and ethical problems are staggering. First, you have all the engineering challenges we've already discussed, multiplied by time. A generation ship would need to function perfectly, not for decades but for centuries. Every system would need to be maintainable and repairable for hundreds of years using only onboard resources. The biological life support system would need to remain balanced through countless growing cycles. The psychological challenges would compound across generations. But there are even deeper problems. How do you maintain mission continuity across generations? The original crew volunteered for this mission. They understood the sacrifice and accepted it. But their children didn't volunteer. They were born into this mission, and their children's children even less so. By the third or fourth generation, you'd have people who have no memory of Earth except through stories and recordings, who never chose this life, who might deeply being trapped on this spacecraft for a mission they don't care about. What happens when a generation decides they don't want to continue? Do they mutiny? Shut down the life support? Turn the ship around? And who's in charge of enforcing mission continuity? You'd essentially need an authoritarian government structure that compels future generations to continue a journey they didn't choose. This is ethically indefensible by any modern standard of human rights. You'd be creating generations of people whose entire existence is subordinated to a mission objective they had no say in determining. There's also genetic drift and inbreeding. To avoid genetic problems, you need a founder population of several hundred genetically diverse individuals. Some estimates suggest at least 500 people to maintain healthy genetic diversity over multiple generations. But supporting 500 people requires an even more massive spacecraft with even larger life support systems. The engineering challenges scale exponentially, and you need to manage reproduction carefully. You can't allow population growth because your resources are fixed. But you also can't allow population decline because you need enough people to maintain the ship and knowledge base. This means implementing reproductive controls, essentially telling people whether and when they can have children. Again, ethically horrifying. Another proposed solution is suspended animation or cryogenic freezing. If you could put the crew to sleep for the journey, they wouldn't age, wouldn't consume resources beyond minimal life support, wouldn't experience the psychological hardships of decades in confinement. They'd close their eyes, leaving Earth, and open them, arriving at a new world. It's an elegant solution, except that it doesn't work. At least not yet, and possibly not ever for complex organisms like humans. We can freeze and revive simple organisms. Tardigrades, those microscopic water bears, can survive freezing, dehydration, even the vacuum of space. Some insects can be frozen and revived. We can freeze human embryos and even some tissues. But freezing and reviving an entire adult human without damage is far beyond our current capabilities. The problem is ice crystal formation. When water freezes, it expands and forms crystals that rupture cell membranes. This destroys tissue at the microscopic level. By the time you thaw someone, their brain, organs, and tissues are damaged beyond repair. Cryoprotectants, chemicals that prevent ice crystal formation, can help. They're used to preserve embryos and small tissue samples, but perfusing an entire human body with cryoprotectants, getting them into every cell, and then removing them after thawing without causing toxicity is immensely difficult. Some organizations offer cryogenic preservation after death, freezing bodies in liquid nitrogen in the hope that future technology might be able to revive and repair them. But this is speculative at best, and none of those bodies have been successfully revived. Even if we solve the freezing and thawing problem, there are other issues. Cosmic radiation still damages frozen tissue. You'd need the same radiation shielding. The cryogenic systems would require power to maintain the extreme cold for decades. They'd need to be incredibly reliable because if they fail and the temperature rises, the crew dies. And someone needs to monitor the systems. Either you need AI sophisticated enough to run the entire ship autonomously for decades, or you need some crew members awake, rotating in shifts, which reintroduces all the psychological problems. There's also the question of what happens if you can't wake someone up. Do you continue the mission with a reduced crew? What if the person who fails to revive is the mission commander or the only medical doctor? Your contingency planning becomes nightmarishly complex. Another frequently proposed solution is to send smaller, faster probes instead of crewed missions. This is actually one of the more realistic approaches. The Breakthrough Starshot initiative, announced in 2016 and backed by investors including the late Stephen Hawking and Mark Zuckerberg, proposes sending thousands of tiny spacecraft, each weighing only a few grams, to Alpha Centauri. These nanocrafts would be accelerated by powerful ground-based lasers pushing against light sails. The lasers would need to be extraordinarily powerful, perhaps 100 gigawatts, focused on each tiny sail, accelerating the craft to 20% of light speed. At that velocity, they could reach Alpha Centauri in about 20 years, plus 4 years for the data to travel back to Earth. That's 24 years from launch to results within a human lifetime. The nanocrafts would carry miniaturized cameras, sensors, and communication equipment. They'd fly past the Alpha Centauri system, taking measurements and images, then beam the data back to Earth. This approach elegantly sidesteps many problems. No life support needed, no decades of human psychological endurance, no biological radiation damage. The probes are so small and numerous that losing some to impacts or failures is acceptable, and the cost, while still enormous, is far less than a crewed mission. Some estimates suggest the Starshot program might cost $5 to $10 billion, comparable to a major space telescope, but a tiny fraction of what a crewed interstellar mission would cost. But even this more modest proposal faces severe challenges. The laser system needed doesn't exist. Building a 100-gigawatt laser array that can focus coherently over millions of kilometers is at the edge of our technological capabilities. The nanocrafts would need to survive the intense laser heating during acceleration without melting or malfunctioning, and at 20% light speed, even a fleck of dust becomes a devastating projectile. The craft would need some kind of shielding, but adding shielding adds mass, which reduces acceleration. The communication system presents another problem. To send data back across 4 light-years, these gram-scale probes need antennas and transmitters. But miniature systems have limited range and bandwidth. The data rate might be so low that it takes years to transmit even a single image. And Earth needs to be listening with large radio telescopes, aiming precisely at where the probe will be years in advance. Any miscalculation and the signal is lost forever. There's also no deceleration. These probes would scream through the Alpha Centauri system at 20% of light speed, spending only a few hours in the inner system before racing off into interstellar space. The observation window is extremely limited, They're essentially doing a high-speed drive-by of another star system. Valuable, certainly, but far from the detailed exploration many people envision. Let's discuss another exotic proposal, antimatter propulsion. As mentioned earlier, antimatter is the most energy-dense fuel possible. A kilogram of antimatter annihilating with a kilogram of matter releases the energy equivalent of about 43 megatons of TNT, roughly the largest thermonuclear bombs ever tested. With perfect conversion of that energy into thrust, you could theoretically achieve very high exhaust velocities, making interstellar missions much more feasible. The problems are almost comical in their severity. First, we currently produce antimatter in particle accelerators in quantities measured in nanograms per year. The total amount of antimatter ever produced by humanity is a fraction of a gram. Producing kilograms would require energy expenditures and infrastructure scaling beyond anything that currently exists. Some estimates suggest that producing a single gram of antimatter might cost trillions of dollars with current technology. Second, storing antimatter is extraordinarily difficult. If it touches any normal matter, even a single atom, it annihilates in a burst of gamma rays. You need magnetic or electric containment systems that keep the antimatter suspended in a perfect vacuum, never touching the container walls. These systems need constant power. If power fails, even briefly, the antimatter contacts the container and explodes. Storing significant quantities of antimatter safely for years or decades during a mission is a materials science and engineering challenge we're nowhere close to solving. Third, even if you have the antimatter and can store it safely, directing the annihilation energy into thrust is difficult. Much of the energy is released as gamma rays and neutrinos, which don't produce thrust and can't be easily controlled. You need reaction mass and some mechanism to convert the energy into directed momentum. The engineering is vastly more complex than chemical or even nuclear rockets. Some physicists have proposed using antimatter-catalyzed nuclear pulse propulsion, where tiny amounts of antimatter trigger fusion reactions in conventional fuel, acting as a catalytic trigger rather than the primary fuel source. This might reduce the antimatter requirements to feasible levels, but the technology remains entirely theoretical. Another speculative concept that appears frequently in discussions of interstellar travel is the Buzzard ramjet, proposed by physicist Robert Buzzard in 1960. The idea is ingenious. Interstellar space, while nearly empty, does contain approximately 1 hydrogen atom per cubic centimeter. A spacecraft could use enormous magnetic fields, extending thousands of kilometers ahead of the ship, to scoop up this hydrogen. The collected hydrogen would then be fused in an onboard fusion reactor, producing energy and thrust. In theory, the ship would gather fuel as it travels, eliminating the need to carry all propellant from Earth. It's an elegant concept that unfortunately doesn't work, at least not as originally envisioned. Multiple analyses since Buzzard's original proposal have identified critical flaws. First, the magnetic scoop would need to be absolutely enormous, with a collection area measured in thousands of square kilometers to gather enough hydrogen to fuel the fusion reactor. Creating and maintaining such a massive magnetic field would require tremendous energy, possibly more energy than the fusion reactor could produce. Second, the hydrogen in interstellar space isn't conveniently ionized and ready to be magnetically controlled. Much of it is neutral atomic hydrogen, which doesn't respond to magnetic fields. You'd need to ionize it first, which requires energy. The energy cost of ionization might exceed the energy gained from fusion. Third, even assuming you can collect the hydrogen efficiently, the drag from plowing through the interstellar medium at high speeds creates resistance that might exceed the thrust produced. Some calculations suggest that a Bussard ramjet would actually slow down rather than speed up once it reaches certain velocities. The ship would be trying to swim through an increasingly thick soup of hydrogen, with the drag overwhelming the propulsive benefit. There have been variations and refinements of the concept. The Bussard ramjet might work as a deceleration device rather than for acceleration. A ship boosted to high speed by other means could deploy the ramjet scoop as it approaches the destination, using the drag and collected hydrogen to slow down. But even this application has problems. The magnetic field configuration needed for efficient deceleration is complex, and the structural stresses on the ship from the drag forces would be immense. Let's turn to another class of proposals that involve not sending physical objects at all, but rather sending information. If we can't feasibly send humans across interstellar distances, maybe we can send the information needed to reconstruct humans at the destination. This leads to concepts like directed panspermia or digital consciousness transfer. Directed panspermia involves sending microorganisms, perhaps extremophiles that can survive harsh conditions, to exoplanets. If the planet has suitable conditions, these microbes could establish themselves and begin terraforming the environment, producing oxygen, breaking down minerals, creating soil. Millions of years later, more complex life could evolve or be introduced. Eventually, the planet becomes habitable for humans. This is thinking on geological timescales, but it sidesteps the problem of keeping humans alive during the journey. The challenges are biological and ethical. First, you need to identify microorganisms that could survive both the journey and the destination environment. They'd need to be robust enough to handle radiation, vacuum conditions if the containment fails, extreme temperature swings, and then thrive in whatever conditions exist on the target planet. Engineering such organisms, perhaps through synthetic biology, might be possible but remains speculative. Second, there's the ethical dimension we touched on earlier. If microbial life already exists on the target planet, introducing Earth microbes could be ecologically catastrophic. We'd be committing biological warfare on a planetary scale, potentially destroying alien ecosystems before we even understand they exist. If no life exists, then we're seeding the galaxy with Earth-origin life, which raises questions about whether we have the right to do so and what our responsibilities are to the ecosystems we create. Digital consciousness transfer takes an even more speculative approach. The idea is to upload human minds into digital form, transmit the data across interstellar distances at light speed, and then either exist as digital entities at the destination or reconstruct physical bodies using the transmitted information and local materials. This requires several breakthroughs that might be impossible. First, we'd need to fully understand consciousness at the neural level and develop technology to map and digitize a complete human mind. This is the hard problem of consciousness, and we're nowhere close to solving it. We don't even know if consciousness is something that can be uploaded, or if it's fundamentally tied to the physical substrate of biological neurons. Second, even if you can upload a mind, the data volume would be staggering. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each with thousands of synaptic connections. Mapping all these connections, their strengths, their chemical states, the entire physical configuration that produces consciousness, would generate petabytes or even exabytes of data. Transmitting this across light years would take years even at light speed and would require enormous amounts of energy to generate a signal strong enough to be detected and decoded at the destination. Third, at the destination, you'd need sophisticated technology waiting to receive the transmission and reconstruct the consciousness. This means either sending equipment ahead, which brings us back to the original problem of physical interstellar travel, or hoping that the destination already has advanced technology, which means you're relying on encountering an alien civilization. Neither option is reliable, and there's a philosophical question that makes many people deeply uncomfortable. If you upload your consciousness and transmit it, is the entity reconstructed at the destination really you, or is it a copy? The original you presumably still exists, or existed at the moment of upload. Are you creating a clone that thinks it's you, while the original dies? Does consciousness survive such a transfer, or does the continuous thread of subjective experience break, creating a new being with your memories who mistakenly believes they're the original? These aren't just philosophical puzzles, but questions with profound implications for whether such a transfer is meaningful. Let's discuss another fundamental barrier that we've touched on but deserves deeper examination: the economics of interstellar travel. The cost of any interstellar mission, whether crewed or robotic, would be astronomical in the literal sense. Current estimates for something like the Breakthrough Starshot project start at $5 to $10 billion, and that's for tiny probes that do a brief flyby. A crewed mission would cost orders of magnitude more. To put this in perspective, the International Space Station, which orbits just 400 kilometers above Earth's surface, cost approximately $150 billion over its decades of construction and operation. It supports a crew of 6 to 7 people in a relatively spacious environment with regular resupply missions from Earth. An interstellar spacecraft would need to be far more sophisticated, carry far more supplies, operate for far longer, with no possibility of resupply or abort, and travel distances millions of times greater. Conservative estimates suggest costs in the trillions of dollars. Some economists have suggested that a crewed interstellar mission might cost as much as 5 to 10% of global GDP sustained over decades. Who would pay for this? No single nation could afford it. International cooperation would be essential, but maintaining such cooperation over the decades required for development and execution would be politically challenging. Space programs are often among the first budget items cut during economic downturns. Public enthusiasm for space exploration waxes and wanes. A project spanning multiple decades would need to survive changes in government, shifts in political priorities, economic crises, wars, and countless other disruptions. There's also the opportunity cost. Trillions of dollars spent on interstellar travel is trillions not spent on addressing Earth's problems. Climate change, poverty, disease, education, infrastructure. Many people would argue, quite reasonably, that these problems deserve priority over a speculative mission to another star system that might not succeed and whose benefits are uncertain. Supporters of space exploration often argue that the technologies developed for space missions produce spin-off benefits for Earth. This is true. NASA research has contributed to advances in materials, science, computer technology, medicine, and many other fields. But is interstellar travel the most efficient way to generate technological innovation? Couldn't we invest directly in those technologies and achieve the benefits more quickly and cheaply? There's also a selection effect in who would go on such a mission. It would likely be highly trained specialists, scientists, engineers, physicians, people who have undergone years of expensive education and training. These are exactly the people whose skills are desperately needed on Earth. Sending them on a one-way mission to another star system represents a tremendous loss of human capital. Their knowledge and skills could have contributed to solving Earth's problems, training the next generation, advancing science and medicine. Instead, they'd be isolated in a metal box, traveling through the void, disconnected from humanity. Now let's confront another uncomfortable truth. The destinations we're discussing might not be worth reaching. Take Proxima Centauri b, the closest confirmed exoplanet. It orbits a red dwarf star, which means several things. Red dwarfs are highly active stars, especially when young. They produce intense stellar flare, bursts of radiation and charged particles that could strip away a planet's atmosphere over time. Proxima Centauri b orbits very close to its star, only about 7 million kilometers closer than Mercury is to our Sun. It's in this close orbit because red dwarfs are dim, and a planet needs to be close to receive enough light and heat to be potentially habitable. But this close orbit means the planet is likely tidally locked, with one side perpetually facing the star and the other in eternal darkness. The day side would be scorched, the night side would be frozen. Only a narrow twilight band might have tolerable temperatures, and only if the planet has a thick atmosphere to distribute heat. But as mentioned, stellar flares might have stripped away that atmosphere long ago. Additionally, the intense stellar activity produces high levels of ultraviolet radiation and X-rays. Any life on the surface would be bombarded with sterilizing radiation. The planet might be geologically dead, with no magnetic field to protect it, no plate tectonics to recycle materials. It might be a barren rock, more hostile than Mars, and that's our closest neighbor. Other potentially habitable exoplanets are even farther away, and most orbit similar red dwarf stars with similar problems. The handful of exoplanets orbiting Sun-like stars are dozens or hundreds of light-years away, putting them completely beyond reach with any conceivable propulsion technology. There's a concept in physics and engineering called the tyranny of the rocket equation, which we discussed earlier in mathematical terms. But let me illustrate its psychological and practical impact more viscerally. Imagine you're designing an interstellar spacecraft. You calculate that you need 10 tons of life support equipment, food, water recycling, radiation shielding, scientific instruments, and habitat for the crew. That's your payload. To accelerate that payload to 10% of light speed, you need propellant. Let's say your engine has an exhaust velocity of 50 kilometers per second, which is extremely optimistic for any realistic propulsion system. The rocket equation tells you that for every kilogram of payload, you need exponentially more propellant depending on your desired velocity change. For the speeds we're discussing, the propellant mass might be hundreds or thousands of times the payload mass. But wait, that propellant has mass, and you need to accelerate it too. And the tanks holding the propellant have mass, and the engines have mass. And all of this additional mass requires even more propellant to accelerate. The numbers spiral out of control. Your 10-ton payload might require a 10,000-ton spacecraft at launch, 99% of which is propellant and fuel tanks, and then you realize you need to slow down at the destination. That requires another entire propulsion system with its own propellant, which you've been carrying the entire journey. The mass doubles again. Now your 10-ton payload requires a 20,000-ton spacecraft. But carrying that deceleration fuel means you need even more acceleration fuel at the beginning. The math becomes absurd. You end up with scenarios where 99.9% of your spacecraft is fuel and the actual useful payload is a tiny fraction. This is why most realistic proposals for interstellar probes don't include deceleration. They accept that the probe will scream through the destination system at high speed and never stop. It's not ideal, but it's the only way to keep the mass budget even remotely feasible. Now consider another dimension of this problem: maintenance knowledge and skills. An interstellar spacecraft is perhaps the most complex machine ever built, with millions of components, intricate systems within systems, all of which must function reliably for decades. On Earth, no single person understands every aspect of complex technology. Building a modern smartphone requires knowledge spanning materials science, semiconductor physics, software engineering, manufacturing processes, supply chain logistics. Thousands of specialists contribute their expertise. On an interstellar spacecraft, you have maybe 10 to 20 people. They can't possibly have comprehensive expertise in every system. You might have a mechanical engineer, an electrical engineer, a life support specialist, a medical doctor, a computer scientist. But modern spacecraft engineering involves specializations far more granular than these broad categories. There are experts in thermal control systems, in guidance algorithms, in plasma physics for specific engine types, in microbiological ecology for life support, in materials fatigue under radiation. Your small crew can't encompass all these specializations, so they rely on documentation, manuals, databases, AI assistants. But documentation becomes outdated as systems evolve and are modified during the mission. Knowledge degrades. The person who installed a system remembers quirks and undocumented features that aren't in the manual. When that person dies or becomes incapacitated, that knowledge is lost. There's a concept called knowledge attrition. Studies of complex systems like nuclear power plants have shown that over decades, institutional knowledge erodes. Older engineers retire or die. Documentation is incomplete or ambiguous. New personnel don't fully understand the original design decisions. Eventually, the organization collectively forgets how parts of its own systems work. Now imagine this happening in a spacecraft where you can't bring in outside experts, can't access external documentation, can't even crowdsource solutions on the internet. You could try to mitigate this with comprehensive training. Every crew member trains on every system, creating redundancy in knowledge. But the human brain has limits. You can't make everyone an expert in everything. People forget skills they don't use regularly. The physician might train on electrical systems, but after years of focusing on medicine, their engineering knowledge degrades. When the electrical engineer dies and an electrical crisis occurs, the physician's rusty knowledge might not be sufficient. Artificial intelligence could help, serving as an external memory and expert system. But AI has limitations. It can retrieve information but struggles with novel situations, with applying knowledge creatively to unprecedented problems. And AI systems themselves require maintenance. The hardware degrades from radiation. Software develops bugs or vulnerabilities. Someone needs to understand the AI well enough to maintain it, which brings us back to the knowledge problem. Let's talk about something even more fundamental: the physics of information transmission over interstellar distances. Suppose your mission succeeds. You reach Proxima Centauri and make incredible discoveries: alien life, exotic physics, resources beyond imagination. You want to tell Earth. You point your antenna at where Earth was when you left and transmit. Your signal spreads out as it travels. Even a highly directional antenna produces a beam that diverges slightly. Over 4 light years, this slight divergence means your signal spreads over an enormous area by the time it reaches Earth's neighborhood. The signal strength follows the inverse square law: double the distance, quarter the strength. At 4 light years, your signal has been attenuated by a factor of about 10 to the 33rd power compared to transmission over 1 kilometer. It's mind-bogglingly weak. For Earth to detect this signal, you need extremely powerful transmitters on the spacecraft and extremely sensitive receivers on Earth. The Deep Space Network, NASA's array of large radio telescopes used to communicate with distant probes, can detect signals from spacecraft at the edge of our solar system, billions of kilometers away. But 4 light-years is roughly 6,000 times farther than the edge of the solar system. The signal would be millions of times weaker. You could increase transmission power, but power is precious on a spacecraft. Every watt used for communication is a watt not available for life support, computers, or other systems. You could use larger antennas, but antennas have mass, and we're back to the rocket equation. You could transmit at lower data rates, sending less information per second, which requires less power for the same signal strength. But at the rates needed to communicate across interstellar distances with available power, you might be sending only a few bits per second. Transmitting a single photograph could take weeks. A video message could take months. And remember, even if Earth receives your message, their reply takes 4 years to reach you. Any conversation has an 8-year round trip. If you ask a question, you wait 8 years for an answer. If you report an emergency and request help, Earth's response arrives 8 years later, by which time you're likely already dead. You're essentially sending messages in bottles into the cosmic ocean, hoping someone finds them someday. This communication lag has profound psychological implications. You can't have a conversation with anyone on Earth. You can only send monologues into the void and occasionally receive monologues in return. The emotional support of real-time communication with family, friends, or psychological counselors is impossible. You're more isolated than any human has ever been. There's also the question of whether Earth would still be listening. When you launch, Earth promises to monitor for your signals. But over decades, priorities change. Funding is cut, equipment fails and isn't replaced. Political situations shift. The organization responsible for monitoring might be disbanded. By the time your first signal arrives 20 or 30 years after launch, Earth might have given up and stopped listening. Your messages would arrive in a cosmic silence, unheard and unacknowledged. Let's examine one more aspect that's rarely discussed: the selection and training of the crew. Who volunteers for a one-way mission to another star system, knowing they'll spend decades in confinement, never return to Earth, never see their families again, and quite possibly die in transit? The psychological profile needed is almost contradictory. You need people with exceptional skills and intelligence because the mission requires solving complex problems. But you also need people who are psychologically resilient enough to handle extreme isolation and monotony. You need people who are cooperative and socially skilled because interpersonal harmony is critical. But you also need people who are independent and self-sufficient because there's no external support. You need people young enough to survive the journey, but mature and experienced enough to handle responsibilities. You need people who are deeply committed to the mission's goals, but also flexible enough to adapt when things don't go according to plan. Finding individuals who combine all these traits is extraordinarily difficult. You're looking for psychological unicorns, and then there's training. The crew would need years, perhaps a decade, of intensive preparation. They'd need to master multiple disciplines, train in emergency procedures, practice living in confined spaces. They'd need medical training to treat injuries and illnesses without access to hospitals. They'd need psychological counseling to prepare for the mental challenges. They'd need to learn how to operate, maintain, and repair every system on the spacecraft. During this training period, they'd be separated from normal life, unable to maintain regular jobs or relationships. The opportunity cost is enormous, and after all this investment, there's a significant chance that some crew members would drop out before launch, unable to handle the psychological pressure or changing their minds about sacrificing their lives. You'd need backup crew members, which multiplies the training costs. There's also the question of how crew members are selected. In a democratic society, on what basis do you decide who gets to go? Is it pure merit, selecting the most qualified candidates? But who defines qualified, and how do you balance technical skills against psychological factors? Is there any consideration of diversity, ensuring the crew represents different backgrounds, genders, cultures? Or is diversity a luxury you can't afford when you need the absolute best specialists? And what about reproduction during the mission? Do you select crew members who are willing to have children in space, creating the next generation? Do you screen for genetic compatibility to avoid hereditary diseases? Do you select couples, or do you expect unattached individuals to form relationships during the mission? The social engineering involved borders on dystopian. Some proposals suggest sending only women, because on average women are smaller, require fewer calories, and studies suggest might be more socially cooperative in confined groups. But this raises obvious ethical questions about gender discrimination. And if you're planning a multi-generational mission and send only women, you'd need to bring frozen sperm or rely on artificial reproductive technology, adding biological complexity. Alternatively, you could send only men, avoiding the complications of pregnancy and childbirth in space. But then you couldn't establish a multi-generational mission, and you'd be relying on a demographic that some studies suggest is more prone to aggression and hierarchy-based conflict. Every option involves uncomfortable trade-offs and ethical compromises. There's no clean solution. So where does all of this leave us? After examining the physics, engineering, biology, psychology, economics, and ethics of interstellar travel, what's the honest assessment? The conclusion, as uncomfortable as it might be for those who dream of spreading humanity among the stars, is that interstellar travel for biological organisms is functionally impossible with any technology we can reasonably envision. Not difficult, not challenging, not something that requires a few more decades of research. Impossible in any practical sense. Every single aspect of the endeavor presents barriers that range from extraordinarily difficult to physically insurmountable. The energy requirements are astronomical. The propulsion systems don't exist and might violate fundamental physics to achieve the necessary performance. The materials needed to build such spacecraft would have properties we can't currently achieve. The biological challenges of keeping humans alive for decades in deep space are immense. The psychological toll would likely destroy crew cohesion and mental health. The economics make no sense. The destinations might not be worth reaching. The scientific value doesn't justify the cost when robotic alternatives exist. And critically, these aren't independent problems where solving one makes the others easier. They're interconnected in ways that make them mutually reinforcing. Solving the propulsion problem makes the radiation problem worse because higher speeds mean more damaging particle collisions. Solving the radiation problem by adding shielding makes the propulsion problem worse because more mass requires more energy. Solving the life support problem by carrying more supplies makes both the mass and propulsion problems worse. Every solution to one problem creates or exacerbates another. This is fundamentally different from the challenges faced by historical explorers. When Magellan circumnavigated the globe, the journey was dangerous and many died, but it was possible with existing technology. Ships, sails, navigation by stars, food preservation, these were all established technologies. The challenge was executing the journey, not inventing entirely new physics. When Apollo went to the moon, it required pushing existing technology to its limits and developing new techniques, but nothing violated physical laws. Rockets worked according to understood principles. The materials existed, even if they had to be manufactured to unprecedented precision. The distances, while vast by human standards, were trivially small in cosmic terms. The crew could return home in days if necessary, and they could communicate with Earth with less than 2 seconds of delay. Interstellar travel is different in kind, not just degree. It's not a matter of building a bigger rocket or training astronauts more thoroughly. It requires technologies that don't exist, might not be possible, and would take centuries to develop even if they are possible, and the margin for error is zero. You can't turn back, you can't call for help, you can't resupply. Every system must work perfectly for decades in the most hostile environment imaginable. Now, does this mean interstellar exploration is completely impossible? No, it means human interstellar exploration is probably impossible, but exploration by other means might be feasible. Robotic probes, especially small ones that can be accelerated to high speeds by external lasers or other means, could potentially reach nearby stars within decades or a century. They wouldn't stay or explore in detail, but they could gather data and transmit it back. More speculatively, if we develop artificial intelligence sophisticated enough, we could send AI explorers. Digital minds don't need life support, don't suffer psychological damage from isolation, can be backed up and redundant, and could potentially function for centuries if given sufficient power and radiation-hardened hardware. An AI mission might be our best realistic option for interstellar exploration. There's also the very long-term possibility, thinking in centuries or millennia rather than decades. If humanity survives and continues advancing technologically, perhaps we'll eventually develop capabilities that seem like magic today. Perhaps we'll discover new physics that allows faster-than-light travel or practical manipulation of space-time. Perhaps we'll transition from biological to digital or hybrid existence, eliminating many current limitations. Perhaps we'll develop molecular nanotechnology that allows us to build spacecraft from materials harvested in space, eliminating launch mass constraints. But these are speculations, science fiction rather than science. They might happen, or we might discover they're impossible. Betting humanity's future on technologies that don't exist and might violate physical laws is not a rational strategy. So what should we do instead? If interstellar colonization isn't a viable backup plan for humanity, what is? The answer is uncomfortable but clear. We need to fix Earth. We need to address climate change, develop sustainable energy and agriculture, manage resources wisely, reduce conflict, and create stable, resilient civilizations. Earth is the only home we have, and the only home we're likely to have for the foreseeable future, possibly forever. We should also focus on exploration and potential settlement within our own solar system. Mars is difficult but not impossible to reach. It could potentially be terraformed over centuries, though that's speculative. The moons of Jupiter and Saturn, particularly Europa and Enceladus, might harbor life and could be sites for research stations. Asteroid mining could provide resources. Space-based solar power could provide clean energy for Earth. These are challenging goals, but they're achievable with existing or near-term technology. They don't require violating physics or developing magical materials. They offer concrete benefits to Earth in terms of resources, scientific knowledge, and technological advancement, and they allow humanity to expand beyond a single planet without requiring us to cross the impossible barriers of interstellar space. We should continue studying exoplanets, searching for biosignatures, listening for signals from other civilizations, not because we'll visit these places, but because understanding whether life is common or rare in the universe addresses profound questions about our place in the cosmos. We should send robotic probes to nearby stars when the technology matures, because the scientific knowledge gained is valuable even if we never follow them ourselves. But we need to be honest about the limitations. The universe is vast, almost beyond comprehension. The distances between stars are not empty spaces waiting to be crossed, but fundamental barriers imposed by physics. The speed of light isn't just a speed limit, but a cosmic quarantine that keeps each star system isolated. We happen to live in one such system, and we're probably going to stay here. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. And there's a certain liberation in accepting it. Instead of fantasizing about escaping Earth's problems by fleeing to other star systems, we can focus on solving those problems here. Instead of imagining we'll colonize the galaxy, we can work on building a sustainable, long-lasting civilization on the planet we evolved on and are adapted to. Earth is a paradise compared to any other location in the universe we could possibly reach. It has breathable air, drinkable water, a protective magnetic field and atmosphere, a stable climate, abundant life, and resources. Every other planet we've discovered is worse, many incomparably worse. The idea that we'd abandon this rare jewel to live in metal boxes or on barren rocks is, when you examine it closely, absurd. The dream of interstellar travel has inspired generations. It's produced great science fiction, motivated technological advancement, and given humanity an aspirational vision. Those are valuable things. But dreams need to be balanced with reality. And the reality is that we're not leaving this star system in any meaningful way. We're stuck here and we need to make it work. Perhaps in some distant future, millions of years from now, our descendants, if any exist and if they're even recognizably human, might develop capabilities we can't imagine. Perhaps they'll find a way. But for us, for our children, for any generation we can reasonably think about, the stars will remain beautiful points of light in the night sky, objects of wonder and study, but not destinations, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the universe is full of civilizations, each isolated on their own worlds, each looking out at the stars and wondering the same thing we wonder, each eventually coming to the same conclusion. Maybe the Great Filter isn't some catastrophe that destroys civilizations, but simply the realization that the universe, for all its vastness, has placed each form of life in its own small corner, to thrive or fail on its own merits, in its own neighborhood. The stars are not our destiny. Earth is our destiny. What we make of it, whether we survive and flourish or squander our potential, will be determined here, in this solar system, on this planet. That's the real challenge facing humanity. And unlike interstellar travel, it's a challenge we can actually meet. If you thought this was dark, wait until you see what actually happens inside a generation ship. Click the video on the screen to find out. It's the nightmare scenario we only hinted at here, and it'll change how you see humanity's future in space forever. Trust me, you need to watch this next.